Have you ever wondered why so many men decide to walk away from marriage after the age of 60? At the very stage of life when everyone believes things should be calm, stable, and without surprises, many men suddenly close a door that seemed eternal and take a step into the unknown. But are they really running away from something, or finally answering an inner call that has always been there? Carl Jung said that the second half of life brings to the surface truths that have been buried for decades. And when those truths emerge, they can become stronger than any promise once made at the altar. What is really behind this decision? Routine, loneliness, repressed shadow, or the search for a freedom that never died? Today, we are going to explore the hidden layers of this choice. Get ready. The explanation may be uncomfortable but also liberating, and it will change the way you see marriage after 60. The silent weight of routine. At the beginning of every marriage, routine feels like comfort. Two people build habits together, share meals, create rituals, and repeat small gestures that make them feel safe. In those early days, repetition is not a burden. It is a promise that tomorrow will look like today and that safety feels like love. Yet as years pass, what once seemed like security begins to feel like heaviness. For many men, especially after 60, that heaviness becomes too much to bear. Routine is not evil by itself. It provides order and predictability. But Jung believed that the human soul was not created to survive only on repetition. The psyche seeks renewal, transformation, and meaning. When the same days stretch on without change, the unconscious starts to rebel. After decades of the same rituals, the same stories, and the same expectations, a quiet voice rises inside a man and whispers, "Is this really all there is?" By the time he reaches 60, that voice is no longer quiet. It demands attention. The silent weight of routine shows itself in subtle ways. It appears in dinners where nothing new is spoken. It appears in mornings where gestures are automatic and empty. It appears when days blur together so much that time itself feels invisible. What once felt like home now begins to resemble a cage. This is the paradox. Routine was essential while raising children, building careers, and surviving challenges. But once those purposes end, the same rhythm feels suffocating. Jung described the second half of life as a time when hidden parts of the psyche, the shadow, return with power. For men, that shadow often contains the desires they buried in order to be responsible, the longing for freedom, the curiosity for new experiences, the hunger for meaning. Routine buries these parts, but it never erases them. After 60, when the awareness of mortality becomes sharp, those repressed needs rise with intensity. They no longer whisper, they shout. And with that, routine, once protective, feels unbearable. This is why many men after 60 question the marriage they once thought would last forever. It is not that they stop loving their partners. It is that they can no longer endure a life that feels like endless repetition. They look at tomorrow and see only yesterday repeated. That realization drains their spirit. Desire fades, imagination disappears, and with it, the feeling of being alive. The question that forms inside them is simple but haunting. Why am I still here? It is not asked with cruelty but with despair. To walk away from marriage at this age is often less about leaving a person than leaving the weight of predictability. What looks like betrayal from the outside is, in Jungian terms, an act of survival. The man is not escaping his wife. He is escaping the cage of his own routine. He seeks to reconnect with the unlived life within him. To stay in suffocating repetition feels more dangerous than stepping into the unknown. The danger of routine lies in its invisibility. Outsiders cannot see it. Even partners may not notice it because it builds quietly over decades. Men endure it because it once had purpose. But when that purpose is gone, the structure becomes hollow. The emptiness of routine is not measured in arguments but in silence. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, a man leaves. In truth, it was not sudden. It was decades of silent weight pressing until the only option was to break free. The tragedy of routine is that it often hides behind normality. People assume that if there are no loud conflicts, the marriage is safe. But sometimes the absence of conflict is not peace, and it is resignation. It is two lives running on autopilot side by side but no longer alive together. And for many men, this quiet resignation becomes unbearable in the later years. They realize they may have fewer decades ahead than behind, and the thought of spending them in silence feels like slow death. This is the silent weight of routine, a burden not of conflict, but of repetition. It presses slowly, invisibly, until it crushes the spirit. When it becomes unbearable, men often choose freedom over familiarity. Jung would say they are not rejecting love, but seeking life. And when a man walks away after 60, it is not always about someone else. It is about finally answering the voice within that refuses to be silenced any longer. Routine built the foundation, but in the end it is often the very reason he breaks free. The invisible call of the second half of life. When a man reaches the age of 60, something profound stirs within him. To the outside world, it may look like he is simply growing older, retiring, slowing down. But inside, another process begins. One that Carl Jung described as the call of the second half of life. It is not about work or possessions anymore. It is about the soul demanding recognition. For decades, many men devote themselves to duty, career, family, stability. They wear the mask of responsibility so long that they forget who they are beneath it. This call is not loud, at least not at first. It begins as a whisper, a subtle sense that something important has been missed. A man may look back on his life and see decades filled with effort, but wonder where meaning truly lies. The unconscious presses forward what has been neglected. Dreams may change, values may shift, and the old definitions of success no longer satisfy. The soul asks for something deeper, and the man can no longer ignore it. Jung believed that the first half of life is about building careers, families, reputations, identities. It is the stage of expansion. But the second half is about integration, confronting the parts of the self that were left behind. If this integration does not happen, a man feels incomplete, even restless. At 60, he senses that time is short, and the need to answer this invisible call becomes urgent. The old ways no longer work. Repetition feels like death, while transformation feels like survival. This is why so many men, even those who appeared stable, suddenly shift course after 60. They are not simply bored. They are responding to something deeper than reason. Their psyche demands authenticity. The invisible call is the pull toward what has been hidden, creativity that was suppressed, desires that were denied, truths that were buried. If ignored, this call turns into despair. If answered, it becomes a source of renewal. But answering it often requires letting go of the structures that once defined them. The invisible call does not mean that a man stops loving his family. Instead, it means he begins to realize that love without authenticity feels hollow. He cannot pretend anymore. He cannot continue living behind the same mask, so he searches for a path that allows him to breathe again. To others, it may look reckless, but within him it feels necessary. Jung would say that the man is finally facing his individuation, the journey toward becoming his true self. Individuation is not about selfishness. It is about wholeness. The tragedy is that society often misunderstands this stage. People label these men as selfish, immature, or irresponsible, but the truth is that many of them are finally listening to their own soul for the first time. After decades of silence, they cannot ignore it anymore. This is why they walk away, not always towards someone else, but away from the life that no longer reflects who they are. The invisible call is rarely about chasing novelty. It is about pursuing meaning before it is too late. The invisible call of the second half of life is not easy to explain. It cannot be measured in material terms. It is felt in the heart, in dreams, in the quiet realization that time is running out. It is the urge to reconcile with the shadow, to embrace the unlived parts of the self, and to seek meaning beyond routine. For many men, ignoring this call feels like slow death. Answering it, even if it means breaking everything, feels like the only way to truly live. It is the kind of choice that looks radical to others but feels inevitable to the one who hears it. And so, when a married man after 60 chooses to walk away, he may not be choosing against his partner. He may simply be choosing for his soul. The invisible call has grown too strong, and to silence it any longer would mean betraying himself. That is why this moment, though painful, is often less about escape and more about awakening. It is not about rejecting love, but about refusing to die with unlived truths still buried inside. To answer the invisible call is to finally step into authenticity, even at the cost of breaking the life once built. If you want to go deeper into these hidden patterns, there is a simple way to start. It's called the Jung method, a path to clarity, self-understanding, and authentic strength. The link is pinned in the first comment. When intimacy turns into distance. In the early years of marriage, intimacy often feels natural. There are conversations that stretch into the night, laughter over small things, touches that feel effortless. Intimacy is not only physical but emotional, the sense that two people are deeply connected, sharing both burdens and joys. But over the decades, something shifts. The connection that once felt effortless can slowly transform into distance. This change rarely happens suddenly. It is the result of years of silence, habits, and unspoken words. Carl Jung believed that intimacy thrives when two individuals continue to grow and confront their inner lives. If growth stops, intimacy fades. A man who once shared freely may become quiet, not because he has nothing to say, but because he feels unseen or unheard. Over time, this silence grows into a wall, and when that wall stands too long, it turns into distance that feels impossible to cross. For men after 60, this distance becomes even more profound. They look at their partner and see not only the person they married, but also the history of unresolved conflicts and words left unsaid. The bedroom that once symbolized closeness can feel like a cold space of routine. Even gestures meant to show care may feel mechanical. The man begins to feel that intimacy has disappeared, leaving only the shell of the relationship behind. Intimacy requires renewal. Without renewal, it collapses into routine. Couples who do not nurture curiosity about each other lose the sense of wonder that first drew them together. When the sense of wonder dies, the relationship becomes functional but not alive. Meals are shared, responsibilities are divided, but hearts drift apart. This quiet drift is one of the most painful experiences in long marriages because it happens without open conflict. It is death by silence, not explosion. Jung would describe this loss as a symptom of deeper psychological neglect. Intimacy cannot survive if the unconscious is ignored. When one partner, often the man, stops exploring his inner life, he loses the ability to remain fully present. Intimacy is not only about what is shared, but about who you are when you show up. If a man rejects his shadow, hides his desires, or refuses to face his fears, he unconsciously creates distance. In this sense, when intimacy turns into distance, it is not always about the partner. It is often about the man's own unresolved inner life. This explains why some men, after decades of quiet separation, decide to walk away. They are not always seeking another woman. They are seeking the experience of being seen and connected again. The distance has grown so wide that they believe it cannot be repaired. At 60, the awareness of mortality makes the thought of living in emotional emptiness unbearable. They long for intimacy, and if they cannot find it in the marriage, they feel forced to leave. The tragedy of distance is that it feels invisible until it is too late. Outsiders may look at the couple and see no conflict. They may even envy the apparent stability. But behind closed doors, silence reigns. And for men who wake up at 60 with the realization that life is short, this silence is unbearable. They long for intimacy, but when they cannot find it, they search elsewhere or decide to walk away. Jung would argue that the distance is not purely relational, but psychological. It reflects the truth that without inner growth, relationships decay. The man who does not nurture his own soul cannot sustain intimacy with another. After 60, the soul no longer tolerates pretense. The mask of stability falls away, and what remains is a hunger for connection. If this hunger is ignored, the man feels dead inside. Leaving, then, is not about escape. It is about survival. When intimacy turns into distance, the marriage can still survive externally. Responsibilities continue, appearances are maintained, and routines are followed. But inside, the man feels absent, like a shadow of himself. This absence eventually becomes intolerable. Walking away is not always about seeking another person. It is about escaping the loneliness that grew inside a relationship where intimacy once thrived. The greatest irony is that one can feel most alone while lying next to someone. In the end, when intimacy becomes distance, the relationship looks whole on the outside but hollow within. The man senses that the time left in life is too precious to spend in quiet emptiness. Jung would say that his soul is demanding renewal, and if he cannot find it in the marriage, he must look elsewhere. This is why, after 60, so many men decide to walk away, not because they stopped valuing intimacy, but because they can no longer live without it. The shadow that returns after 60. Carl Jung often wrote that what we repress in the first half of life eventually returns in the second. He called this the shadow, the hidden, denied, or unlived parts of ourselves that do not vanish but wait in silence. For many men, the shadow is made of desires they buried to become responsible. The hunger for freedom, the drive for adventure, the need for self-expression. These parts were pushed aside while they built careers, raised families, and fulfilled obligations. But after 60, when the outside roles lose weight, the inner life demands attention. The return of the shadow after 60 is not a gentle process. It often comes with urgency, almost like a demand. A man begins to dream more vividly, to feel restless, to sense that something inside him is unfinished. The shadow may appear in sudden desires, unexpected emotions, or an attraction to possibilities that seem irrational. Beneath these impulses lies a deeper truth. The psyche wants to be whole, and wholeness requires that the rejected parts of the self finally be acknowledged. Throughout life, men are taught to deny weakness, suppress desire, and focus on duty. The father figure, the worker, the husband, these roles require sacrifice. But every sacrifice leaves behind fragments of self. A passion for art, a taste for risk, a curiosity for meaning. If denied, these remain alive in the unconscious. At 60, with fewer years ahead than behind, these fragments surface with urgency. The shadow does not ask politely. It insists. It says, "See me or I will take control." When men ignore their shadow, they feel hollow. They may appear successful and stable, but inside they are divided. The first half of life teaches them to hide the parts that do not fit the image of the good husband, the reliable worker, the steady father. But these suppressed elements do not die. They gather strength in silence. At 60, when the outer roles lose importance, the inner life grows louder. The shadow steps forward, demanding attention. For many men, this confrontation is terrifying. To acknowledge the shadow means to admit that much of life was lived incompletely. It can feel like failure, but Jung would say it is a chance for transformation. If the shadow is ignored, it often bursts out destructively, through affairs, reckless choices, or the sudden abandonment of commitments. To outsiders, it looks irrational, but inside it feels like survival. The man is trying to reclaim pieces of himself buried for decades. Jung argued that integrating the shadow is the essential task of the second half of life. Integration does not mean acting on every impulse, but acknowledging its presence, listening to what it represents. A man who admits his need for freedom, his longing for meaning, and his hunger for change is less likely to be controlled by them. But when he denies them, they erupt in destructive ways. Leaving marriage after 60 is often the dramatic result of decades of shadow denial. It is not only about the relationship, but about the self that demands to be heard. The shadow often carries creativity that was never expressed. A man who abandoned his dreams for stability may suddenly feel compelled to revisit them. He might crave travel, art, or adventure, not because he is reckless, but because those desires were always part of him. Without giving them space, he feels incomplete. Walking away from marriage may look like betrayal, but psychologically it can be a desperate attempt to honor these unlived parts before time runs out. The tragedy is that many couples misunderstand this process. The partner sees only rejection, not the deeper psychological demand. She may believe he has changed, but in truth he is uncovering what was always there. The man is not trying to destroy love. He is trying to rescue the parts of himself that were suffocated by decades of duty. Jung believed that without this integration, the second half of life becomes empty, no matter how stable it looks on the surface. When the shadow returns after 60, it can either destroy or transform. If denied, it tears apart stability. If embraced, it can renew life with authenticity. Jung saw this confrontation as unavoidable. The soul demands wholeness, and the shadow is part of that wholeness. For many men, facing this truth leads to choices that surprise those around them. But from within, these choices feel like survival. They are not abandoning love. They are seeking the parts of themselves they left behind. This is why the shadow's return is so powerful. It reminds men that life is short, that authenticity cannot be postponed forever. And when a man listens to his shadow after 60, the decision to walk away is not always about leaving someone else. It is about finally returning to himself. The desire for freedom that never grows old. From youth to old age, one longing remains constant in the human heart: the desire for freedom. For men, this longing can be both a source of strength and a hidden weight. During the first half of life, freedom is often exchanged for responsibility. A man chooses duty over adventure, stability over risk, and family over self. He convinces himself that one day later there will be time to live for himself. But when he reaches 60, he realizes that later has arrived, and much of that freedom was postponed into silence. Jung observed that freedom is not a luxury of youth, but a need of the soul at every age. To deny it is to deny part of one's own nature. At 60, when men feel the walls of time closing in, the hunger for freedom grows stronger, not weaker. They do not crave freedom because they are childish or reckless, but because they sense that their remaining years must be lived authentically. What once could be postponed now demands urgency. The clock of mortality makes every compromise heavier, every silence harder to carry. This desire does not always mean the man wants to abandon everything. Sometimes it means he wants space to breathe, to rediscover forgotten passions, to live without the constant weight of duty. For decades, he has followed a script written by society. Build a career, provide for the family, maintain appearances, sacrifice the self. The cost of this script is often invisible until later. Freedom was traded for security, but stability without freedom becomes suffocation. At 60, the contradiction between the life he lived and the life he longed for becomes unbearable. Jung would argue that this fire is not rebellion but individuation, the soul's attempt to reclaim what was lost. In the first half of life, freedom is narrowed by necessity. In the second half, it demands expansion. The man who ignores this call risks falling into despair. He may remain in his marriage, outwardly stable, but inwardly resentful, feeling like a prisoner of his own choices. The man who listens may face criticism, but he feels alive again. For him, the risk of leaving is less frightening than the risk of dying without ever having lived fully. Freedom, for a man in his later years, often takes unexpected forms. It can be the freedom to rest without guilt, to speak the truth without fear, to explore passions that were buried. It can be the freedom to spend time in silence, to choose peace over noise, to embrace authenticity over pretense. These are not acts of irresponsibility. They are acts of survival. Without them, the soul withers. With them, the soul breathes and revives. Even small freedoms, like saying no without guilt or choosing silence over meaningless conversation, become sacred. The tragedy is that many marriages cannot hold this new desire. A partner may see it as rejection, as if he no longer loves her. But in truth, it is not about rejecting love. It is about rejecting confinement. If he cannot find freedom within the marriage, he feels compelled to search for it outside. The decision is not made lightly. It is made after years of feeling restrained, after realizing that the time left must reflect the truth within. The desire for freedom does not vanish with age. If anything, it intensifies. Some men seek freedom in new relationships, others in solitude, others in passions long denied. The form it takes matters less than the essence, to live without chains. To ignore this call is to sink into bitterness, to age with regret. To answer it is to feel alive, even if the answer breaks the old order. This is why so many men after 60 make choices that surprise those around them. It is not selfishness. It is survival of the spirit. Jung insisted that the unlived life always waits beneath the surface, demanding recognition before the end. In the end, the desire for freedom that never grows old explains why many married men walk away. They are not rejecting love but reclaiming themselves. They are choosing to live fully and authentically before time runs out. Jung would say they are seeking individuation, the process of becoming whole, and wholeness is impossible without freedom. To deny this desire is to deny the soul itself, and no man can tolerate that denial when the horizon of life comes so near. Freedom does not fade with age. It grows sharper, more urgent, and impossible to ignore. The silence that hides the truth. In many long marriages, silence becomes the language. At first, silence can be peaceful, a sign of comfort between two people who no longer need to fill every moment with words. But with time, silence can turn heavy. It becomes the space where truths are avoided, where questions are never asked, and where feelings are buried. By 60, many men find themselves living inside this silence, carrying truths they have never spoken, and for some, that silence becomes unbearable. Jung believed that what is left unspoken does not disappear. It sinks into the unconscious, gathering power until it erupts. When a man avoids speaking his real needs, desires, and disappointments, those unsaid truths form shadows that haunt him. The marriage may look calm on the outside, but beneath the surface, resentment and longing grow. Silence becomes a prison, and the man himself becomes both the prisoner and the guard. For decades, silence often serves a purpose. It avoids conflict, preserves peace, and keeps the structure of family life intact. But after 60, when the urgency of time grows sharper, silence loses its function. Instead of preserving peace, it feels like suffocation. A man looks at the years ahead and realizes that to remain silent is to die without ever having spoken his truth. This realization is often the breaking point. Silence hides the truth about dissatisfaction, about loneliness, about the longing for something more. Many men hide behind routine, believing it is better not to disturb the balance. But Jung would argue that repression only delays the inevitable. What is repressed in the unconscious eventually returns, demanding attention. At 60, the unconscious has waited long enough and silence cracks under the weight of truth. When silence dominates a marriage, intimacy fades. Partners stop asking deep questions, stop exploring each other's inner lives. Instead, life becomes a series of tasks, obligations, and surface conversations. For men who crave meaning in the later years, this emptiness is devastating. They no longer want to pretend that everything is fine. They want honesty, even if it is painful. And if honesty cannot live inside the marriage, they may seek it elsewhere. Jung described this hunger for truth as part of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the hidden parts of the self. Silence blocks individuation because it prevents real confrontation with what lies inside. To break the silence is to risk conflict, but it is also to invite growth. Many men realize too late that their silence did not protect love. It killed it slowly, and once they see this clearly, leaving feels less like betrayal and more like survival. The tragedy is that silence often tricks couples into thinking everything is stable. Outsiders may admire the quiet marriage, interpreting the lack of conflict as harmony. But inside, the silence is filled with unspoken pain. The man who has lived decades without voicing his inner truth eventually feels invisible, not only to his partner but to himself. That invisibility is intolerable after 60. It becomes a daily reminder that he has silenced his own soul. Breaking free from silence can take many forms. Some men finally begin to speak honestly, but others feel it is too late within the structure of their marriage. They fear their truth would shatter everything, so they choose instead to step away. To leave the marriage is, in their eyes, the only way to live authentically, the only way to give voice to what has been silent for too long. Jung would argue that such a decision, however painful, is the psyche's demand for wholeness. Silence is not just the absence of words, it is the burial of truth. And when truth is buried, the soul suffers. At 60, men can no longer bear the weight of this suffering. They would rather face the storm of change than endure another decade of silence. In this way, walking away is less about abandoning someone else and more about finally listening to themselves. In the end, the silence that hides the truth explains why many men leave after 60. They are not rejecting companionship, but rejecting the emptiness of words never spoken. To live authentically, they must break free from the prison of silence and allow truth to guide the final chapter of their lives. And for many, the cost of staying silent has become far greater than the cost of leaving. The confrontation with mortality. By the time a man reaches 60, one truth becomes impossible to avoid. Life is finite. The awareness of mortality that once lingered in the background now steps into the foreground of daily thought. He looks at his body, his health, the passing of time, and realizes that he has fewer years ahead than behind. For many men, this realization is not just intellectual. It is emotional, spiritual, and deeply unsettling. It shakes the very foundation of the life they have built, and it often leads to the question, have I truly lived or have I only existed? Jung believed that confrontation with mortality was one of the most transformative experiences in human life. To face death is to face the ultimate shadow, the truth that everything ends. When a man has not lived authentically, mortality becomes unbearable because it reminds him of all the unlived moments, all the silenced desires, all the abandoned parts of himself. At 60, the pressure of mortality can push him into crisis, not because he fears death itself, but because he fears dying without ever having lived as his true self. For decades, many men distract themselves from mortality with work, ambition, and responsibility. They fill their lives with tasks so they will not hear the ticking clock. But when retirement arrives or when health begins to falter, distractions fail. The silence of mortality grows louder. In that silence, the man is forced to ask, have I lived as myself or have I lived as a role? The answer to that question determines whether he feels peace or despair. The confrontation with mortality can transform priorities overnight. What once seemed important possessions, appearances, even old grudges, begins to fade. What becomes urgent is authenticity. Men begin to ask, what do I truly want with the time I have left? For many, the honest answer is painful, because it reveals how far they have drifted from their own soul. The life they built may look successful, but inside it feels incomplete, and mortality will not let them ignore that truth any longer. This is why so many men after 60 leave marriages that seemed stable. They are not simply chasing youth or novelty. They are responding to the sharp reminder that time is short. Mortality exposes the cost of denial. To live the rest of life in silence, routine, or distance feels like betrayal of the soul. Jung would say that mortality is the great awakener. It forces the psyche to demand wholeness. A man cannot hide behind masks when he knows the mask will soon be buried with him. The awareness of death does not always lead to despair. It can also lead to courage. Many men, once they face mortality, find the strength to make choices they avoided for decades. They are no longer afraid of judgment, because judgment feels small compared to the finality of death. They would rather risk conflict, rejection, or loss than endure the slow death of living inauthentically. Mortality in this sense becomes a teacher, stripping away illusions and leaving only what matters. But this confrontation is not easy for partners to understand. To them, the man's decision to leave may look selfish or cruel. Yet in his mind, it is the only way to honor the truth revealed by mortality. He is not abandoning love. He is abandoning the lie of pretending that half a life is enough. The pain of the decision is real, but so is the necessity. To deny it would be to deny the reality of death itself, and no one can silence that reality forever. Jung emphasized that the second half of life requires reconciliation with mortality. Without it, the soul stagnates. With it, the soul awakens. For many men, awakening means walking away from the structures that no longer reflect who they are. Marriage may be one of those structures. The confrontation with mortality makes clear that the cost of staying may be greater than the cost of leaving. In the end, the confrontation with mortality is both terrifying and liberating. It reminds men that their time is limited, but it also frees them from illusions. They realize they must live now, not later. And for many, that realization leads to choices that outsiders cannot understand but that make perfect sense to the soul. This is why so many married men walk away after 60, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally understood that life, in its briefness, must be lived authentically, without delay. The awakening of authenticity. By the time a man reaches 60, the question of authenticity becomes impossible to avoid. For years, he may have lived according to duty, expectation, and habit. He played the roles of provider, protector, and partner. These roles gave meaning for a time, but they also created masks. At 60, the masks grow heavy. The soul begins to demand something deeper, the chance to live not as a role, but as the man he truly is. This awakening of authenticity explains why so many men, even after decades of service, decide to walk away from what no longer feels true. Jung believed that authenticity was the central goal of individuation. To be authentic is not simply to be honest with others, but to live in harmony with one's inner truth. For decades, many men silence that truth. They fear it will cause conflict or disappointment. But repression has a cost. By 60, the weight of inauthentic living becomes unbearable. A man looks at his life and sees not just what he has done, but what he has left undone. Authenticity is no longer optional. It is the only path forward. Authenticity requires courage. It means telling the truth even when it disrupts peace. It means embracing desires once denied. It means admitting mistakes and longings that were buried. For many men, this awakening is frightening, but it is also liberating. Once the need for authenticity rises, it cannot be silenced. The soul will not return to sleep once it has awakened. This is why, after 60, so many men walk away from marriages that seem stable. They are not always chasing someone new. They are chasing themselves. They want a life where their words match their feelings, where choices reflect their true desires, where their remaining years feel real. To stay in a life that feels false is to accept death before dying. To leave, though painful, feels like a chance to live authentically, even if only for the years that remain. The awakening of authenticity changes how men see love, work, and time itself. Love without truth feels empty. Work without meaning feels pointless, and time without authenticity feels wasted. The man who awakens at 60 begins to reorder his life. He seeks relationships that nourish his soul, activities that reflect his passions, and moments that feel alive. Jung would say this is the final stage of individuation, the moment when a man becomes whole by embracing who he really is. The tragedy is that this awakening often comes too late for the structures he built. The marriage, shaped by decades of compromise, may not be able to hold the truth that now demands expression. For the partner, this can feel like betrayal, but for the man, it feels like survival. He cannot go back to sleep. He cannot put the mask on again. Authenticity has called, and to ignore it would be to betray himself completely. Authenticity also means reconciling with the shadow. The man must face the parts of himself he denied, his fears, his desires, his vulnerabilities. Only by embracing them can he live fully. Jung insisted that authenticity was impossible without this confrontation. To awaken is not only to embrace the light, but also to accept the darkness as part of the whole. After 60, this integration feels urgent. The man senses that his final decades must reflect his true self, not a performance. This awakening explains why many men make choices that surprise those around them. They leave behind careers, friendships, and even marriages. They seek simplicity, peace, creativity, or spiritual depth. To others, it may look irrational, but for the man, it feels like clarity at last. He no longer wants to waste time pretending. He wants to spend what remains of his life in truth. In the end, the awakening of authenticity is both painful and beautiful. It often means breaking structures that once felt secure, but it also means finally living as oneself. For men after 60, authenticity is no longer a luxury. It is the only way to meet the end of life with peace. To ignore it is to die in silence. To embrace it is to live fully, even if only for a short time. Walking away from marriage is rarely about rejection. It is about answering the deepest call of the soul, the call to be whole. Authenticity is the final gift of time. When a man chooses to live his truth, even if it costs him comfort, he steps into life as it was meant to be lived. Jung would say that the soul waits patiently, but it never forgets. At 60, the waiting ends. The masks fall, the silence breaks, and the man finally meets himself. And though it may hurt, it is in that meeting that life truly begins.